She was the only battleship to get underway during the attack on Pearl Harbor. When the war ended, the Navy didn't retire the USS Nevada. They painted her bright orange-red, anchored her at the center of a nuclear target fleet at Bikini Atoll, and detonated atomic bombs around her. She survived those too. And that's when the real problem began. Because what the blasts left behind wasn't damage you could see or patch. It was radiation fused into the steel itself, contamination the Navy could measure but never reverse. How America's toughest warship ended up still radioactive on the ocean floor begins long before the bomb. On December 7th, 1941, the Nevada lay moored at the end of Battleship Row. When Japanese planes struck, she was the first battleship to sound general quarters. Amidst the explosions and choking oil smoke, her crew did the unthinkable. They raised steam. Lieutenant Lawrence Ruff, the ship's communications officer, stood on the bridge as the 27,000-ton behemoth began to move. She was the only battleship to successfully break her moorings and head for the open sea. But as she neared the channel, Japanese bombers zeroed in, desperate to sink her and block the harbor entrance. A torpedo tore into her port bow, and 5 bombs ripped through her deck, one detonating right inside Ruff's department. To prevent the Nevada from blocking the exit channel, her officers made a critical decision. They intentionally ran her aground at Hospital Point. She was battered, burning, and flooded, but she did not sink. Refloated just 3 weeks later, she underwent a massive salvage operation and modernization. The ship that the enemy thought they had destroyed returned to lead the Allied fleet. She became a legend of American resilience. On June 6, 1944, she was the first battleship to open fire on the Normandy beaches at Utah Beach, neutralizing German artillery. By the end of the war, she had earned 7 battle stars, shelling enemy positions from southern France to the black sands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She was a living symbol of national survival, a steel monument that had earned her retirement. The end of the war did not bring quiet retirement. Instead, the Navy earmarked the legendary vessel for a far more clinical assignment, Operation Crossroads, the first post-war nuclear experiments at Bikini Atoll. Joint Task Force 1 required a massive, heavily armored target fleet to study how atomic weapons would affect standard-type capital ships. The Nevada fit these technical needs perfectly. Her displacement of 27,500 tons and her length of 583 feet provided a substantial, realistic platform for testing blast and thermal limits. Built with the classic all-or-nothing armor configuration, her turrets carried steel up to 18 inches thick, offering a rare opportunity to observe how traditional naval defense held up against nuclear force. But her physical attributes were only part of the decision. Having been decommissioned in early 1946, she was already slated for disposal, meaning her use avoided the loss of an active warship. Beyond pure economics, Navy planners and the Atomic Energy Commission recognized the public impact of her legendary status. Utilizing the ultimate survivor of Pearl Harbor transformed a symbol of national resilience into a high-profile tool of institutional utility. Workers prepared the ship by removing her active weaponry and applying a coat of bright orange-red paint. This vivid coloration served a precise technical function, acting as the primary aiming point for the B-29 bombardiers navigating high above the Pacific. The iconic battleship, once the pride of the fleet, was prepared to anchor in the lagoon as a giant target. On the morning of July 1st, 1946, the B-29 Superfortress Dave's Dream lined up its high-altitude run over Bikini Lagoon. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bombardier released a 23-kiloton plutonium bomb, designated Able, aiming directly for the battleship anchored at the center of the 73-ship target fleet. But as the weapon fell, it drifted significantly off course. Instead of detonating directly over the vessel, The bomb exploded 520 feet above the water, falling 980 feet short and nearly 1,900 feet to the left of its aiming point. This massive miss of roughly 650 meters spared the battleship from the direct physical contact of the nuclear fireball. Rather than being vaporized, she faced a displaced shockwave. The blast still hit with immense force, crumpling superstructure decks, tearing away light equipment, and scorching the ship with thermal heat. Yet, her heavy belt and turret armor, designed to withstand the heaviest naval artillery, remained structurally intact. Onboard instruments and test animals placed throughout the decks captured the first empirical data of a nuclear airburst's impact on a capital ship, measuring blast pressure, thermal radiation, and the initial wave of prompt gamma rays. The survivor of Pearl Harbor had survived her first atomic encounter, structurally battered but still proudly afloat. The blast and thermal destruction were dramatic, but they were not the entire story. On July 25, 1946, Joint Task Force 1 executed the second test, codenamed Baker. This time, the 23-kiloton plutonium bomb was suspended 90 feet beneath the surface of Bikini Lagoon. When the weapon detonated, it did not create the towering flash of an atmospheric explosion. Instead, it unleashed a heavy subterranean shockwave through the water. A dome of spray rose from the lagoon, rapidly expanding into a column of water 2,000 feet wide and nearly 10,000 feet high. This column contained over 2 million tons of highly radioactive water, dredged directly from the lagoon floor. As this colossal pillar of water collapsed, it generated a dense, radioactive mist, a base surge that rolled across the target fleet. The lagoon environment became a self-contained trap. Unlike the Able airburst, which dispersed its radiation into the upper atmosphere, the Baker explosion concentrated its radioactive force within the water itself. The Nevada, anchored near the center of the array, was drenched in millions of gallons of highly contaminated seawater. The water column and shockwave hammered her hull, but the real damage was invisible. The intense burst of neutrons from the underwater detonation penetrated her steel armor, interacting with the very elements of her construction. When survey teams in protective gear returned to Bikini Atoll hours later, they faced an immediate radiological crisis. Geiger counters screamed as they approached the target vessels. The seawater itself was radioactive, and the spray had coated the Nevada's decks, superstructure, and interior spaces with a toxic radioactive film. Initial monitoring teams recorded hazardous dose rates on the target ships, realizing immediately that this was a disaster unlike any the Navy had ever encountered. The survivor of Pearl Harbor had survived the physical blast once again, but she was now enveloped in a silent, invisible poison. The fallout and radioactive water washing over the Nevada left more than a dirty residue. The spray carried microscopic fission products that settled onto every horizontal deck, slipped into interior compartments, and wedged deep into hard-to-reach voids and complex machinery. This surface contamination was highly dangerous, but it was essentially a physical dust. In theory, it could be scrubbed, scraped, or sandblasted away, much like heavy grease or salt buildup. But the second, far more permanent form of radioactivity occurred at the subatomic level, where simple cleaning was completely useless. During the underwater detonation, a massive flood of subatomic particles called neutrons shot through the lagoon, penetrating directly into the battleship's thick steel armor, copper wiring, and brass fittings. When these neutrons collided with the stable atoms inside the ship's metal, those atoms absorbed them, transforming into unstable, radioactive isotopes. This process is called neutron activation. This physical and chemical shift meant the steel itself had changed from within. The Nevada was no longer just a ship carrying radioactive dirt. The very metal of her hull had become a source of radiation. Instead of a fictional, cinematic green glow, this radioactivity was completely invisible, detected only by the frantic clicking of Geiger counters. The hazard remained potent because of the long lifespans of these newly formed elements. For example, cobalt-60, created directly within the ship's steel, has a half-life of over 5 years, meaning it takes that long for its radiation to decrease by half. Cesium-137, a highly soluble fission product that bonded to her surfaces, has a half-life of 30 years. This atomic change created a radioactive legacy that could not be washed away, establishing a decay timeline that would last for generations. In late 1946 and early 1947, Navy radiation survey teams boarded the Nevada to assess the damage. Equipped with film badges pinned to their fatigues and heavy Geiger counters, technicians swept the decks, recording radiation levels that frequently went off the scale. The Navy's immediate response was a brute force cleaning campaign. Salvage crews began with high-pressure water washdowns, spraying millions of gallons of seawater across the blistered orange paint. When that failed to lower the radiation readings, they turned to abrasive chemical scrubbing and sandblasting. Men in canvas suits and respirators scraped at the superstructure, trying to physically peel away the radioactive layer. But the cleanup was a losing battle. The high-pressure hoses often spread the contamination further, carrying radioactive particles into the ship's complex ventilation system and interior voids. Runoff water contaminated the surrounding lagoon, and the very sand used for blasting became hazardous waste. The cleaning equipment itself also frequently broke down, with pumps clogging and sandblasting nozzles wearing out under the harsh conditions. The Geiger counters continued to register persistent hotspots, particularly around the heavy steel turrets and brass fittings where neutron exposure had been most intense. Every attempt at decontamination met a physical boundary. The ship's own structural materials were emitting the radiation from within. By the end of 1947, the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory calculated the cost of a full cleanup. The price of rendering the battleship safe for human habitation far exceeded the cost of building a new modern warship. The effort was deemed completely impractical. The human toll of these trials extended beyond the salvage crews and technicians, who began reporting skin irritations, unexplained fatigue, and nausea after their shifts on the hot decks. Farther away, the displaced people of Bikini Atoll watched the operations from distant islands, having been told their exile was temporary. They could see the ruined ships, slowly realizing that their homeland, like the great battleship anchored in its lagoon, had been permanently changed. The Navy issued its final verdict. The Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory officially classified the USS Nevada as a permanent radioactive hulk. The battleship that had survived Pearl Harbor and Normandy could not be saved by scrubbing brushes or sand. On August 29, 1946, the Navy stripped the Nevada of her active status, formally decommissioning the legendary battleship just over a month after the Baker test. The ship was no longer a weapon of war. She was a permanent liability. Naval Command realized that the vessel's heavy steel armor, designed to shield her from the fiercest enemy shells, had become her own worst enemy. The radioactive isotopes locked inside her steel could not be scraped away, making it impossible for crews to safely live or work aboard her ever again. This stark reality turned a complex technical crisis into a final administrative decision. With her active career finished, tugs towed the radioactive hulk from Bikini Atoll back to Pearl Harbor. For over a year, researchers used her contaminated hull as a floating laboratory to study the long-term behavior of radiation in naval metals. But there was only one practical way to solve the problem of a radioactive capital ship. On July 31, 1948, the Navy towed the Nevada 65 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor. She was positioned as a target for a massive live-fire gunnery exercise, giving newer vessels a chance to test their modern weapons against her legendary defense. For hours, ships and planes hammered her with heavy artillery and rockets. Even in her contaminated state, the old survivor refused to go down easily. An aerial torpedo strike delivered the fatal blow. The Nevada slipped beneath the waves, settling 15,000 feet onto the Pacific floor, taking her invisible atomic cargo down with her. For 72 years, the battleship rested in total darkness, a silent resident of the abyssal plain. In May 2020, a joint marine archaeology expedition by Search Incorporated and Ocean Infinity located the hull 65 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, resting 15,400 feet down on the Pacific floor. At this extreme depth, the wreckage remains remarkably intact. High-definition cameras from robotic submersibles captured a ghostly sight. The white number 140 painted on her hull remains clear and legible, the exact target designation assigned to her for the Bikini Atoll tests. While 7 decades of natural decay have reduced her radiation levels to the background noise of the sea bottom, this visual marker links her directly to the atomic age. The ship did not disappear when she sank. She became a preserved monument of a perilous transition. The institutional lessons learned from her highly contaminated hull drove immediate changes in military safety, establishing stricter radiological guidelines and shaping later test policies. Ultimately, the hard realities of the Baker test contributed to the shift toward the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, which permanently banned underwater nuclear testing. Today, the Nevada lies in quiet exile. The vessel that survived the fires of Pearl Harbor and battered German defenses at Normandy remains on the seabed, a physical reminder of national power and the enduring legacy of the unintended consequences of the nuclear era. Today, the Nevada rests 3 miles deep in the Pacific. Her silent, radioactive steel is a monument to a permanent threshold. The atomic age altered the very nature of our world. She remains a quiet warning about the forces we unleash. What do you think of her legacy? Share your thoughts below.